for developing our piece, the first and probably most important consideration is instrumentation. Now, our piece has three clearly defined sections. We have this intro love theme, our comedy, and then our lullaby section, which is a little bit of a repeat of the love theme at the beginning. I mean, at the minute, it's an exact repeat, but we're going to do a few tweaks to make it a little bit different. What we need to think about is how our instruments are going to meld together. Now, with us having such differences, like a really kind of soft, loving theme versus a really comedy theme, the temptation would be to have totally different instruments, but then there's going to be a huge divide between those two sections, and we want them to sound like they're from the same piece. So really, we want to be thinking about instruments that will work for both of those sections. So for comedy, like a kazoo might work, you know, kind of a silly sound, but there's no way that that's ever going to fit in with our love theme section. But something like a clarinet might work. Clarinet can be both beautiful with a really full-bodied sound, but also a little bit quirky if it's played staccato and bouncily. Likewise, for our harmony section, a string pad would work really nicely for some held chords, and then the pizzicato strings would work really well in that comedy section. If I combine those strings with a piano, maybe a celeste, which is like a high-pitched bell type sound like you hear at the beginning of Hedwig's theme in Harry Potter, we'll have a really nice blend of instrumentation there. And then I can bring little instruments in. So the kazoo that I mentioned, I could bring it in quietly in the comedy section behind the other instruments and it would still fit well. I'm not saying that you have to stick with the exact same lineup, but it's really good to think about which instruments can carry forward to give some continuity to the piece. So I'm going to first load up the instruments that I want and make sure I put them in the order that I want them to appear, and then look at how we can expand those pieces onto there. I'm also going to think about the articulations of those instruments as well. So I mentioned pizzicato strings and also legato strings, and I'm going to load up a separate track for each of those articulations. I find it easier to work and see them that way. You can use articulation sets in Logic where you can have all of the articulations on one track. Personally, I find that becomes a little bit more finicky, and I'm not going to be putting this into score or anything like that. So there's no reason for me to have everything on one track like that. Another thing that's important to think about when you're loading your instruments is how you want to have the parts laid out. For strings, for example, you could just load a full string section and have everything on one section, or you could load the individual instruments and pad it out, write it out for the individual instruments. The second way is the better way to do it per instrument, but it takes a bit more practice and a bit more time. For what we're trying to achieve, I'm just going to stick with a general string section rather than individual instruments. Once you have your instruments loaded, the next stage is to actually get your parts onto those instruments. It's tempting to just copy and paste the parts on, which is fine if your original part is well played, but you'll find that because I played it on piano, I played it in a certain way on the piano. And by just dumping it onto this clarinet part, it's not going to sound very nicely played at all. It's not terrible, but it's not quite how a clarinetist would play it. So ideally, you'll want to load your clarinet part and then try and learn the piece as if you were playing clarinet. So try and get into the mindset of a clarinet player, how they blow, how their fingers move, where they have to breathe, and then learn the part on the keyboard as a clarinet player and then record it in. So they need to breathe here. And if you really think about that, then your parts are going to have a lot more life to them straight away. There'll be a few tweaks we have to do later, naturally, in the production stage to get them sounding even more realistic and a bit nicer. But if you can get it played in like a real player would play it, it's really going to help further down the line. In terms of arranging the other parts onto instruments, it's just a case of thinking about which instruments capture the emotion that you're trying to get at each stage, and also about the right range to write in those instruments. So the clarinet there, for example, in that mid register is very comfortable, very soft, whereas if it was going to be really high, It's a lot more piercing already, and it's not a very natural sound to be playing in that really high register very softly for a clarinet player. So again, learning about your instrument is really, really important, but just think carefully. Generally for wind instruments, the higher register is more difficult to keep soft and controlled. Not always, but generally. The middle register is nice and full-bodied, and the lower register can also be a bit shouty because they have to put a bit more support and a bit more wind to get that lower register out. On most instruments, the mid-register, the mid-range of that instrument is the safest place to stay. You can find the ranges of instruments just by going on Google and searching for range of violin, for example. There's normally on the Wikipedia page, it gives you the range. There's some really good articles on it. So find the range and then figure out where's comfortable within that range around the middle, and you'll be choosing the safest place. Or working with sample libraries like we are, some of them limit the range, so you physically can't play outside of the range of certain instruments. Others, you will just naturally hear what sounds right or not. If you're playing an instrument and it sounds really high and really awkward, you're probably writing in the wrong range, so see if you can rearrange it slightly. So think about the mood you're trying to capture and which instruments capture that best. So for example, this lullaby section, the chord sequence is going to sound best on celeste. I already know that because that's a natural place for it to sit. If I drag that down onto celeste right now, we'll just solo it. You'll hear it's a lovely lullaby kind of sound without me doing anything to it. So that already has that lullaby sound to it. So we need to take this information and pad it out into our other instruments. We might also have to add some things. So this little pattern probably isn't going to work on legato strings. So we could try it if I copy it straight over. But in reality, I'm probably going to write some new chord sequence for those strings as well. You hear how it's a little bit awkward on that string part. So I think I'll write some actual just pad chords very softly in the strings. And really the strings focus is going to be in the comedy section where they come through with their pizzicato sound. Pizzicato is where the string is plucked instead of bowed. So I'll have that pit strings where they're the center of attention. Under this section, we'll probably have them just very quietly and very softly, which brings me to my next point, which is about doubling instruments as well to create certain sounds. So that clarinet part might sound a little bit weak or a little bit too low, too full-bodied. I could add a solo flute with that clarinet. And now if I copy that region across the both, you'll hear, I'll just get rid of these. That gives it a bit more breathiness, a bit more body to it. And I could even put this up an octave. Oops. And you'll have it, again, fuller and a bit more piercing. This is where playing in those parts becomes very, very important as well, because you'll hear those are an exact copy, and no instruments would ever move that perfectly in time with one another, no matter how good the players are. There's always going to be some slight fluctuations in timing and how they phrase things. So learning to play the actual part and play it for those instruments is going to really bring them alive. Likewise, this celesta part at the end here, that might work really well if I doubled that on a music box. If you're not sure where a sound is in the library, you can just search for it in here as well. Music box. So again, if I just double this part onto the music box, and I might take that up an octave too. Okay, that's not a great sounding music box, but it will do for what we're doing. If we double that celeste sound on a music box, we'll turn the music box so it's really soft in the background. And later on in the mix stage, you could add a whole load of reverb to it to put it more into the background as well. This is why it's really handy to know about the stages that you're going through and what you can do to things so that you don't get caught up thinking that doesn't sound quite right. Later on in the mix, you can edit it and tweak it a little bit too. You see, with the music box turned all the way down, just right in the background, it really adds that lullaby kind of feel. The music box traditionally is one of those spiral things that plucks little strings. You can buy on probably car boot sales or souvenir shops. You twist the little bar and the reel turns and plucks little metal bars. That's what a music box is. So it's naturally a lullaby sound. This music box is obviously a synthetic music box, so it sounds a bit weird. But if you had access to a different music box sample, it would work really nicely. But with a bit of reverb on and turned right the way down, doubled with that celeste, you get a really nice lullaby kind of sound. So thinking about how your instruments can be doubled can really improve the sound of your piece as well. And that's really what separates some of the pros from some of the amateurs. An amateur will just load a clarinet part, play it, and then be confused as to why it can't be heard in the mix, or why it doesn't have any piercing quality, or why it's not full-bodied enough. Whereas a pro knows that the clarinet on its own isn't going to get that sound. It needs to be doubled with a flute, for example. Or if you want it to really come through, double it with a xylophone, so there's a really percussive sound. So you'll hear the xylophone hit the note, so that note stands out, and then the clarinet gives the body to it afterwards. Thinking about how you can double those instruments will really improve the arrangements and orchestrations of your pieces. I'm going to crack on, orchestrate this out for these instruments, and then we'll recap once it's all fully padded out, and I'll take you through some of the decisions that have been made.